Have you ever been in a room full of people celebrating something you poured your entire soul into, yet felt completely invisible? That was me, standing in a cobalt silk dress that felt more like a costume than my own skin, watching 200 guests toast my younger sister's wedding with a vintage I had literally lost sleep over for years. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Chloe, and if you want to know my story, you have to look at my hands. They aren't the delicate manicured hands of my sister, Isabel. They are a winemaker's hands, with faint scars from pruning shears, calloused from lifting oak barrels, and stained a permanent, deep purple under the nails from the thousands of grapes I have crushed over 30 years. They are the hands that built the Crestwood estate legacy, a legacy I was about to watch my family burn to the ground. It all started subtly, as these things often do, a quiet erosion of trust, a series of unfortunate accidents that always seemed to leave me looking careless and my sister looking like the serene, competent savior. For years, I had been the heart of Crestwood's winemaking operations, while Isabel charmed critics and distributors with her dazzling smile and stories she'd rehearsed from my own tasting notes. I was the one in the cellar at 3 in the morning, nursing a fermentation, monitoring temperatures, and coaxing the soul of our land into a bottle. My father, Arthur, always promised my time was coming. "You are the artist, Chloe," he'd say, "but Isabel has the head for business, together. You'll be unstoppable. Soon, everyone will know your name." The first real crack in the foundation appeared during the development of our new Sauvignon Blanc. I had spent months cultivating a unique strain of yeast, one that promised to bring out unusual notes of honeysuckle and flint. It was my secret weapon, the key to what I believed would be our most acclaimed white wine yet. I kept the mother culture in a climate-controlled incubator in my private lab, a room no one ever entered but me. One morning, I walked in to find the incubator door slightly ajar, the digital temperature reading blinking an angry red. The entire culture was ruined, a cloudy, useless sludge. When I raised the issue, my voice tight with a grief only a creator could understand, Isabel just placed a comforting hand on my arm. "Oh, Chloe, I'm so sorry. The cleaning crew was in here last night. Maybe they bumped it. You know how clumsy they can be." My father's frown wasn't directed at the loss, but at me. "You should have had it locked. Chloe, a culture that valuable needs better security protocols. This is what I mean about the business side of things." I didn't have the energy to argue that there was no lock, and that the cleaning crew had never once been allowed in my lab. The narrative was already set. I was the careless artist, and Isabel was the compassionate sister. The final, devastating blow came 3 years ago. We were on the cusp of entering the Golden Grape International Wine Competition, the most prestigious event in the industry. A win there wouldn't just be an award. It would secure our distribution in Europe and double the value of our estate overnight. I spent a month preparing our entry, a vertical tasting of our flagship Cabernet Sauvignon from 3 different years. The paperwork was a nightmare of chemical analyses, terroir reports, and detailed tasting notes. I finished the entire package 2 days before the courier deadline and left the seal box on my desk for my father's final signature. The next morning, it was gone. Panic clawed at my throat as I searched my office, then the main office, my questions growing more frantic. No one had seen it. My father's face was a mask of cold fury. "This was your one responsibility. Chloe, your one job." I spent the next 24 hours in a caffeine-fueled haze, trying to recreate the complex submission from scratch. Knowing it was impossible, we missed the deadline. The opportunity was lost. 2 days later, Isabel called a family meeting in the Grand Library. She looked distraught, her eyes filled with rehearsed tears. "Dad, Chloe, I have to tell you something." She held up a clear plastic bag. Inside were the shredded remains of my submission forms and the smashed sample bottles. "I found this in the recycling bin behind Chloe's cottage. I didn't want to believe it, but I think she was scared. Scared we would lose, and it would reflect badly on her. My father didn't even look at me. He just looked at the bag, his jaw tightening. Jealousy, he said, his voice a low growl. You were jealous that Isabel was getting the credit, so you sabotaged us all. In that moment, watching him look at me with such profound disgust, something inside me shattered. It wasn't just about the competition anymore. It was the realization that in his eyes, I would always be the supporting act, the difficult, moody artist, while Isabel would forever be the star. The next day, he publicly reassigned all my experimental projects to a junior winemaker and put me in charge of overseeing the bottling line for our budget table wine. My lab, my sanctuary, was given to my former assistant. I was demoted in my own home, a ghost in the cellar. The final humiliation came a few weeks later. To lift everyone's spirits, my father held a small dinner for our top distributors. He stood to give a toast, raising a glass of the very wine I had created, the one that had won us Winery of the Year the previous season. He talked about legacy, about the future, and about how Isabel's steady hand had guided the company through a difficult patch. Then he turned to her, a small velvet box in his hand. He opened it to reveal our grandmother's grapevine pin, a delicate piece of gold and emeralds. Your grandmother always said this belonged to the true heart of Crestwood, he said, pinning it to her dress. I think it's time it found its home. I just sat there, my hands resting in my lap, feeling the phantom stain of grapes under my nails. And I didn't say a word. For the next 3 years, I became a model employee. I did my job on the bottling line with meticulous precision. I kept my head down, my opinions to myself. The passion I once had was replaced by a quiet, cold efficiency. My demotion had an unintended side effect. It gave me time. With my creative responsibilities gone, I started taking on small pro bono consulting jobs, helping local organic farms improve their soil quality. It was reputation work, as Isabel called it, not revenue work, but it kept my mind sharp. One of my clients was a small, struggling cooperative run by a woman named Dr. Alana Reed, a retired professor of agriculture with a fierce reputation for integrity. She needed help analyzing the historical soil maps of her property, which bordered Crestwood. That's what led me back to our archives, a dusty, forgotten room in the oldest part of the cellar. I was searching for soil surveys from the 1970s. Long before my time, the records were a mess, stored in old wooden filing cabinets. As I pulled out a heavy drawer, a thick leather-bound ledger fell to the floor, spilling its contents. It wasn't a soil map. It was one of my grandfather's private farm journals from 20 years ago. Tucked inside were documents that didn't belong there, carbon copies of shipping manifests, invoices from an industrial grape supplier in the Central Valley, and a series of coded financial statements. My blood ran cold. The dates on the invoices coincided with the year of the Great Blight, a devastating disease that had wiped out nearly half the vineyards in the valley. It was the year my father had famously told the press that Crestwood had been spared by a miracle, a story that had become family legend. The manifest detailed the purchase of thousands of tons of cheap, low-quality Merlot and Cabernet grapes, the kind used for mass-market jug wine. Then I turned a page in my grandfather's journal. His elegant cursive was shaky, desperate. Arthur's solution is a disgrace, he wrote. He's buying cheap fruit and blending it into our estate wines. He says it's temporary, a way to survive. But it is a lie. This is not Crestwood anymore. The soul of our land is gone, and he has replaced it with a counterfeit. My hands shook as I read on. The fraud hadn't been temporary. It had become standard practice, the award-winning Founder's Reserve. Our most expensive and celebrated wine, the very symbol of our estate, was a lie my entire career. All my meticulous work perfecting that blend had been spent polishing a fraud. I hadn't been working with our legendary, estate-grown grapes. I had been blending them with cheap filler, unknowingly becoming the chief artist of my father's deception. A cold, clarifying calm settled over me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the chilling quiet that comes after a massive explosion. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I spent the next 2 hours in that dusty room, methodically photographing every single page with my phone, every invoice, every manifest, every heartbreaking word from my grandfather's journal. I created a secure encrypted file and saved it to a cloud server, then backed it up on a thumb drive that I hid in my car. Over the next few months, I continued my work on the bottling line, my face a mask of serene indifference, but my evenings were spent building a case. During my meetings with Dr. Reed, I started asking careful hypothetical questions about agricultural fraud, about labeling laws, and about the authority of the State Wine Standards Commission, on which, it turned out, she held a senior position. I also quietly accepted an invitation for a video call with a boutique winery in Oregon, a competitor who had been trying to recruit me for years. They admired my artistry, they said, and wanted to give me a blank canvas. I told them I was interested, but the timing had to be perfect. The wedding invitation arrived like a summons. Isabel was marrying the son of a prominent New York investor, a union my father proudly called a merger of dynasties. The wedding was to be held at the estate, a massive, opulent affair designed to showcase Crestwood's success to 200 of the most influential people in the worlds of finance and wine. I knew this would be the final act. I arrived at the grand tent set up on the main lawn, the air thick with the scent of white roses and money. I found my father's assistant near the entrance. Her smile stretched a little too tight. "Chloe, there you are," she said, avoiding my eyes. "There's been a small mix-up with the seating chart." She led me away from the front of the tent, past the long, beautifully decorated tables where our family and prominent guests were seated. We went past the tables for business associates, past the tables for old family friends, until we reached the very back, to a small, wobbly round table hidden almost completely behind a massive oak support pillar. The DJ's assistant and the tent rental company's foreman were already seated there, looking as awkward as I felt. "This came directly from Isabel," the assistant whispered before scurrying away, across the room. I saw her, Isabel, perfect in her couture gown, caught my eye. She was wearing our grandmother's grapevine pin. She smirked, a tiny, triumphant little smile, before turning back to her new husband. I didn't make a scene. I simply sat down at my wobbly table, took a deep breath, and waited. Later, a familiar voice cut through my isolation. "That's a rather creative place to seat the sister of the bride." I looked up to see Dr. Alana Reed, elegant and sharp-eyed, looking from me to the pillar with a raised eyebrow. "Dr. Reed," I said, standing. "I didn't know you were on the guest list." She smiled coolly. "Your father and I have our disagreements, but we serve on some of the same charity boards, I must say. Chloe, your work with the cooperative has been impressive. We were just discussing it at the last commission meeting." My father and Isabel saw us talking. A flicker of confusion, then annoyance, crossed their faces before my father hurried over, oozing charm. "Alana, what a pleasure. I see you found Chloe, hiding back here." "Doctor?" Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. "We were just discussing your daughter's expertise in agricultural compliance. She's become quite an asset to the local community." My father's smile faltered. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not as his daughter, but as an unknown quantity, an independent player with connections he didn't understand. It was the first time in 3 years I had seen a flicker of fear in his eyes. The speeches began after dinner. My father took the stage, his voice booming with pride. He spoke of my grandfather's vision, of legacy, of integrity. He lavished praise on Isabel, her business sense, her charm, her leadership. "3 years ago," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, "Isabel's quick thinking and loyalty saved this estate from a potentially disastrous mistake. She is the future of Crestwood." Finally, he raised his glass high. "And so, it is my greatest honor to announce that upon my retirement next year, Isabel will be taking over as president of Crestwood Estate." As the applause echoed, he asked, "Would anyone else like to say a few words?" A polite silence fell over the room. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, my own champagne glass untouched on the table before me. I walked calmly to the stage and took the spare microphone. I do, I said, my voice perfectly steady. I have something to share. The room went completely still. My father speaks of my grandfather's legacy, I began, looking out at the sea of expectant faces, a legacy built on the unique terroir of our land. Today, I had to make a choice between that legacy and the truth. I took out my phone. With a few taps, I connected it to the large projector screen behind the stage, which had been displaying a rotating slideshow of photos of Isabel and her new husband. The photos vanished, replaced by a single high-resolution image, a scanned copy of an invoice from an industrial supplier for 20 tons of cheap Merlot grapes, dated just before the bottling of the 2018 Founders Reserve, the very wine they were all holding in their glasses. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The truth, I continued, my voice clear and calm, is that the soul of Crestwood died with my grandfather's vines 20 years ago. The wine in your glass is a beautifully crafted lie. I swiped on my phone, and an image of my grandfather's journal entry appeared on the screen. The shaky, desperate handwriting was damning. Isabel shot to her feet, her face as white as her dress. She's lying! This is just jealousy. She's always been jealous. I ignored her, my eyes fixed on the audience. I have submitted these documents, along with 20 years of fraudulent financial records, to the Federal Wine Standards Board and the IRS. They will begin their investigation on Monday morning. Then, for the final blow, I have also, as of this morning, accepted a position as head winemaker and partner at Northwood Vintners in Oregon. Chaos erupted. Isabel was screaming. My father stood frozen, his face ashen. Guests were pulling out their phones, recording, whispering in shocked disbelief. I placed the microphone back on its stand with a soft click that seemed to echo in the cavernous tent. I walked back to my forgotten table behind the pillar to retrieve my purse. Isabel lunged at me, her manicured nails digging into my arm. "You ungrateful witch, after everything we've done for you!" I looked down at her hand, then up into her face, my voice barely a whisper but sharp as glass. "Everything you've done to me. You mean your little performance with the torn competition forms was very convincing. It's a shame. The security cameras in the main office automatically archived to the cloud." Her hand dropped from my arm, as if she'd been burned. My father approached, his composure shattered. "Chloe, please, we can fix this. We can talk about this as a family, in private." I looked at the man who had refused to believe me, who had publicly shamed me, and handed my life's work to my saboteur. "We've had 3 years for private conversations. Dad," I said softly, "you chose not to have them." I turned and walked toward the exit, the sounds of my family's perfect world imploding behind me. Just before I stepped out into the cool night air, I heard him call out, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're destroying our family's legacy?" I paused for a moment and turned back to face the stunned, silent room. "No," I said, my voice carrying to every corner. "You and Isabel did that when you chose fraud over integrity. I'm just turning on the lights." 6 months later, I was standing on a hill in Oregon, the crisp air smelling of pine and damp earth. My new corner office at Northwood Vintners overlooked a valley of young, promising vines. The news from back home had been swift and brutal. Crestwood Estate was in receivership, tangled in federal investigations and a dozen lawsuits from distributors. Isabel's husband had their marriage annulled on grounds of fraud, and my father's name, once a pillar of the wine community, was now a synonym for disgrace. He had called, of course, dozens of times. The voicemails had progressed from rage to pleading to broken apologies. The last one had just been a long, weary sigh and the words, "You were right. I was a fool." Then came a letter, delivered by courier. In it, he offered me everything. He would dissolve the old company, make me the sole owner of the land, publicly apologize, whatever it took, if I would just come home and help him rebuild the legacy. I took the letter and walked out to the small fire pit behind my new cottage. I watched the paper curl and blacken. his desperate words turning to ash and smoke before drifting away into the vast Oregon sky. The legacy he was clinging to had been a prison built of lies. My legacy was right here, in the rich, honest soil under my feet, waiting for me to plant the first vine. The table they banished me to now sits empty, and I am finally sitting at the head of my own,